Just hours into the new year, we were reminded that the jihad against the West is not over. It's not even taking a winter break. A man the FBI identified as Shamsud Din Jabbar, inspired by the Islamic State, also known as ISIS, drove a pickup truck into a crowd in the French Quarter of New Orleans. He managed to murder at least 15 people and injured dozens of others. He then jumped out of his vehicle and began shooting at police, who returned fire and killed him. 2 officers were wounded in the shootout. Hours later, a Tesla Cybertruck exploded outside the Trump Hotel in Las Vegas, Nevada. The explosion was caused either by a bomb carried in the bed of the truck or by a very large quantity of fireworks, or maybe both. Police said the driver was killed. 7 bystanders suffered minor injuries. Hours later in New York City, demonstrators chanted, "There is only one solution, intifada revolution, and no war on Iran." Do you get that? These demonstrators support both Sunni and Shia terrorists. This is the hard left telling you what they mean by tolerance, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're recording this edition of Foreign Policy on Thursday, January 2nd, and it's for release on Friday, January 3rd, and there's much we don't know about the 2 attacks. But about jihadis and their fanboys and fangirls in America and other Western countries, we should know quite a bit by now. U.S. and European policies, however, have failed to utilize that knowledge to significant effect. I want to discuss all that and more, and then talk about the decisions that Iran's ruler, Ali Khamenei, the world's foremost sponsor of terrorism, must be pondering, as Israelis, forced into a full-blown war over a year ago, diminish Hezbollah, Khamenei's terrorist militia in Lebanon, and Hamas, his terrorist client in Gaza, and destroy the military capabilities of Syria, a month ago essentially a colony of Islamic Republic of Iran, perhaps soon to be a colony of Turkey. I'm Cliff May. With me today is Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of FDD's Iran program. He oversees FDD's work on the Islamic Republic of Iran. He's also a senior fellow specializing in Iranian security and political issues. You're part of this conversation too, here on listener-supported Foreign Policy. Welcome, Behnam. Good to see you.
Great to be with you, Cliff, and Happy New Year to you and Danielle and all the listeners.
Look, let's start with the news because I'm an old-fashioned newspaper man, and that's just an ingrained habit with me. According to Memory, which is an indispensable resource, a prominent pro-ISIS Telegram channel praised Jabbar for his blessed attack against the Dogs of the Cross in New Orleans. And our colleague, John at FDD, John Chanzer, he posted on Twitter, or X, what do you call it nowadays, "We are watching the return of Sunni jihadism after several years of a false narrative that the war on terror was over." Anyhow, let me start with that and just get some of your thoughts, and I have some things I want to add.
Yeah, this is really the 31 flavors of jihadism. It doesn't matter if it's Sunni, it doesn't matter if it's Shiite, it doesn't matter if it's lone wolf, it doesn't matter if it's proxy, it doesn't matter if it's carried out by a transnational criminal syndicate or a true believer. This is a threat the West is facing socially, politically, militarily, economically, demographically, even because of the vast range and shapes and styles and colors that it comes in. And I think the inability, unfortunately, for the West, for the democracies of the world particularly, to walk and chew gum at the same time on this threat, to be able to get good or get smart on countering all of the different flavors and types of it, has led us to over-focus on one when we think we've beaten back that one, to kind of pull back from the concept altogether and look to pivot towards something else. For example, we have right now President Trump about to be sworn in just a couple of weeks. The world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism has tried to hire foreign nationals to carry out an assassination plot against that individual. At the same time, we have exactly this spread of terror activity, some thwarted, some successful, some reportedly, allegedly, still evolving, accidental, we don't know, happening on U.S. soil. This means that there has to be a marriage of the law enforcement apparatus and the national security apparatus to deal with these 31 flavors of jihadism. And until we have that marriage, we're going to be constantly in this reactive mode, hoping that it's the terrorists who slip up and miss or botch an operation rather than us who are good enough to intercept or thwart before it even happens.
Yeah, I might add that the falsity of the narrative that we have defeated even Sunni terrorism or that ISIS isn't a problem anymore, Al Qaeda isn't a problem, is obvious just from a little recent history. The Wall Street Journal had this note: the carnage on Bourbon Street is the direct descendant of the 2016 Islamic State truck rampage in Nice, France, that killed 86 people and injured hundreds of others. It's the deranged offspring of the 2016 attack in Berlin's Christmas market that killed 13. It's the direct follow-up of the 2017 truck attack that killed 8 people and injured a dozen others on Manhattan's West Side. So this is, by no means gone. Now, the Shia regime in Tehran and its terrorist proxies have at least eclipsed the Sunni terrorist groups such as ISIS and Al Qaeda, I think, over the last couple of years, particularly. The exception, of course, would be Hamas, which is Sunni but looked to Tehran as much as Qatar and Turkey for support. I guess one point to keep in mind here, and this gets back to your 31 flavors of jihadism, is that Sunni jihadis and Shia jihadis are essentially rivals, just as Al Qaeda and ISIS are essentially rivals. But what you may have seen here now in New Orleans, probably, we don't know for sure. It probably was a lone wolf attack. I don't know that he had a whole cell. There's some reports of that, probably not. But it's not hard for him to have been inspired and sort of taught by ISIS theologians online. And of course, he was in the military. One wonders, did nobody see signs of this in the military? And if they did, were they afraid to say anything? Because that would be considered Islamophobic, and because DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, that was the ideology of the military as mandated in an executive order by President Biden.
Yeah, I think we're still learning a bit more of the facts in the New Orleans case, but certainly this has been a trend, especially when you look at Sunni jihadism, which doesn't benefit from what Shia jihadism does, which is that major state backer. That's one of the sharpest differences when looking at these two different brands or strands of jihadism. The ability of a state like Iran to put state resources into first what it calls an axis of resistance, and then through embassies, cultural centers, religious centers, charities all around the world have a more formalized recruitment. And then looking at the Sunni side of the street, their informal recruitment. I'm reminded of the magazine that I think it was Al Qaeda had, Inspire, that Awlaki, the U.S. citizen, originally of Yemeni extraction, right, if I'm not mistaken, was literally inspired towards. So there is so much of this material out there that is simply waiting for the right kind of exogenous events to shift someone's life who is already on the edge and to give them this pathway, to give them those tools. I'm very worried about, again, the detection challenge, the detection of the institution that this person came from, which is the U.S. military, and also the law enforcement versus national security apparatus, which is how do you actually stop this stuff on Telegram, on social media? Mm-hmm. How do you actually take down pages that are actually helping you fly to war zones today where there's all flavors of the jihad raging? This is much more than a much tougher issue than just something that can be fixed with a congressional bill.
True, although I would argue that it is always useful to simply know your enemy, find your enemy, eliminate your enemy. I'm all for information operations, but at the end of the day, I think the kinetic is vital. And that's just the reality we have to face. So the example of that is we have troops in northeast Syria leading Kurdish and some Arab forces in an effort to suppress ISIS, right? That ISIS has been deprived of its land area. We call this caliphate, but it still exists there. And there are thousands of ISIS combatants and families essentially in detention. They're kept in detention by the Kurdish forces, the American elite forces. Small number was 900. I think it's about 2,000 now. Are working with. There are those on the right as well as the left who say, well, why bother? Just bring those troops home. We don't need to worry about it. Then you have Erdogan, essentially the president for life of Turkey, and a very much, I think, a neo-imperialist, saying, yeah, you can do that and we'll take care of ISIS. Don't worry, except he's supported ISIS at various points in the past. And he also calls the Kurds that the Americans have been working with terrorists, and he wants to kill them. And there are those who say, yeah, let him kill them. Not our problem. I got to say, I vehemently disagree with both. I think the mission that the Americans have in the Middle East is absolutely vital if we are to suppress this. And the way to suppress this is to defeat them, because Messianic movements, if you want to talk about information operations, when Messianic movements see that Allah doesn't support and endorse their endeavor because it gives them defeat, not victory, that more than anything else you can do in terms of information operations tends to debilitate them. At least that's my view.
Certainly major defeats can debilitate them. The challenge, of course, though, is if they're messianic movements to begin with, or if they're kind of apocalyptical folk. Some of these people don't have a price. Some of these people don't have a breaking point. And as Bernard Lewis said, there are folks who destruction is an inducement, not a source of deterrence. So in that world, I mean, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. But I don't like to go down that world anyway, because as someone who actually has minored in theological studies, but also believes in the judicious use of force, this is really more about us than them. We have to define what it is in the Middle East that matters to us. We haven't finished that national debate. That is a national debate still ongoing. I think it was a national debate even after 9/11 that was stunted and needlessly securitized. And we're paying the cost of it today, where you have the ascendant wings of both parties now trying to retreat and not even define a single source of an interest or a single thing that can assist U.S., American, Israeli, Arab partnered security even in that part of the world. It's cutting and running on steroids because it simply does not even want to engage in that national debate. And what I have tried to do in this town is engage some of these folks politely in that debate. And I've pressed them for, well, what is it in your view that is worth fighting, killing, and dying for? And when you can't do that, don't you believe it's judicious to work by, with, and through local partners who have that interest because they are local partners? Like you say continuously, Cliff, about the Ukrainians. So long as the Ukrainians are willing to fight, it's quite odd that the Americans are going to be more Catholic than the Pope when it comes to taking on the Russians, given the Ukrainian proximity relative to our proximity. The same exists for the Kurds. The same exists for local Arab partners. The list can go on and on. But I find these folks, both on the right and left, respectfully, a little bit disingenuous because they haven't actually defined a national interest. I'm totally all for a more judicious or narrowly scoped one, but I can't seem to pin them down on what do you believe is worth fighting, killing, and dying for.
Well, you can pin me down, but because I'm going to say it as concisely as I can. What we have right now is a Cold War, in some places hot, being waged against particularly against America and American preeminence in the world, and the American leadership in a world order. And who's waging this Cold War? It's what we call at FTD often the axis of aggressors. And that means Beijing aligned with Moscow, aligned with Tehran, aligned with Pyongyang, aligned with such junior partners as Havana and Caracas. And they are very much helpful to this axis, helpful to the various jihadi proxies. So you now have credible reports of the Chinese supplying weapons to the Houthis in Yemen to be used to shut down the Red Sea against shipping, but they would make an exception, as long as they get weapons from China, for Chinese-flagged vessels. This group, this axis, they want to rule the world. They want to make the laws for and decide what is international law, defining it and redefining it any way that is convenient to them. And we have to prevent them from achieving their ambitions. It's an odd coalition of communists and Islamists and I don't know, whatever you would call the regime in North Korea, and neo-imperialists in Russia. We have to understand these are serious enemies, Stop talking about we're going to cooperate on climate change. We're not. Understand that they have to be frustrated in their efforts and in some cases very decisively defeated. Because if you don't like forever wars, then you have to do one of two things: decisively win or lose and take the consequences. Otherwise, those wars will go on. Anyhow,
just a quick footnote to there, because I want to strongly second this last point you mentioned, which is there's competing, but then there's also playing to win. There's managing a problem, and then there's also solving a problem. And the way you can shorten the competition window is to have it not just a theory of victory, but a strategy of victory. And that's what I find frustrated by, both these extremes on the left and the right in America. They don't even seem to believe in winning anymore.
No, that's right. They don't think that wars can be won, but wars can be lost for sure. And actually, my most recent column refers to a Ronald Reagan Institute survey. And what it finds, I think, encouragingly, is that most Americans know we need a military that is absolutely, demonstrably, and clearly superior to any in the world, so much so that no one thinks they can have a fair fight against us. Whether it's the Houthis, whether it's the communist Chinese in terms of Taiwan, they should see you don't want to fight the Americans, you will lose. If they think that, you will deter them. Hopefully, and then you don't have to fight a war, and you don't have to win a war. But if you do have to fight a war, you do win it. All right, I did want to move on from the news because there's other things I want to ask you about, and in particular, curious to get your take on this. Given the damage the Israelis have now done to Hamas and Hezbollah, what does Ali Khamenei, the ruler of Iran, do? Does he build them back better, or does he cut his losses at this point? Because it's not so easy, I would think, to build back Hezbollah and Hamas at this point.
Well, Ali Khamenei has not just a theory of victory, but a strategy for victory. And I like the use, or dare I say, the appropriation of Build Back Better, because I think that's exactly what he wants to do. It's just on a much longer, larger timeline. One of the things that the Islamic Republic in the medium term, and then I'll share the short term in a second, but in the medium term is banking on is exactly this Western pessimism, frustration, tiredness, with the way things are going on in the multiple boom and bust cycles in the Middle East. And when the West gets tired and frustrated and distracted, it looks elsewhere. And that is what creates a more permissive environment for Ali Khamenei to do exactly what you mentioned, which is build back better. Admittedly, it's a heck of a lot harder, not just because of the year of exceptionally impressive Israeli military successes that nearly a year and a half ago, everybody in the West was telling you was essentially impossible to have. But it's also impossible because we're about to or much harder because we're coming up on the 5th anniversary now of the killing of one of the chief architects of this regional strategy. And that's Qasem Soleimani. January 3rd is the 5-year anniversary of the killing of Iran's chief terrorist, the man who architected so much of this ecumenical terror strategy, the man who turned the failed states and the war zones of the Middle East into a land bridge or terror highway for Tehran, and the man who used frustrated and downtrodden and dispossessed Arabs across the heartland of the Muslim world against Americans, against Israelis, against Arabs themselves. And the inability for Khamenei to do that in the short term is brought to you by the collapse of the twin pillars of his terror strategy. Qasem Soleimani by the Americans via Israeli intelligence in 2020, and Hassan Nasrallah by the Israelis in the post-October 7 Middle East just this fall, 2024, by the Israelis. And one reason why Tehran's terror network didn't feel that imminent drop out after January 2020 is because of how well plugged in Lebanese Hezbollah has been in that Iran-backed axis of terror in the region. But with the collapse of these two or twin pillars of Tehran's terror strategy, they are reeling from defeat after defeat. And if you look at Khamenei, watch his speeches, not just listen to his speeches, 3 very important speeches since the October 25-26 Israeli military retaliation on Iranian territory that gutted them of their long-range air defenses, struck a covert weaponization facility, went after ballistic missile production sites that are integral to the production line of the regime's missile arsenal for the future. He looks visibly angry. He looks visibly frustrated, but he is a man who believes still every word of the propaganda he's saying because he sees it as fact, he sees it as news. Just 2 days ago, Iranian press, I think 1 or 2 days ago, depending on the time zone and when this airs, but Iranian press simulated a three-directional attack on Israel from Iran, from Iraq, and from Yemen. And as I watched that simulation, which, by the way, Memory did very nice subtitles for our audience who doesn't speak Persian, I was reminded of what I saw in January 2024, where there was exactly the same 2 missiles that Iran fired in April 2024 against Israel, plus the same target in a military drill, in a mock-up drill. So more often than not, this regime telegraphs what it wants, and Khamenei continues to telegraph what he wants, and he wants to rebuild that axis of resistance. He is talking about Syrian youth, reclaiming their country. So just because we may be waning and waxing in attention and tired of the conflicts of the region doesn't mean that he is, because after all, he sits at the top of a state whose resources he's proven time and again he's willing not to spend on the Iranian national interests or on the public good or on the Iranian people, but on this transnational terror project.
Yes, but haven't we learned in the last 5 years that personnel makes a difference? Qasem Soleimani was an extraordinarily skilled terrorist leader and organizer of these things. His successor has not been. I'm not sure that there is that within the junior leadership of Hezbollah, there is another Hassan Nasrallah ready to take the reins. Plus, you have the problem that all this takes quite a bit of money. Now, I would say the Islamic Republic of Iran has been enriched over the past 4 years by Biden. Why? Because he thought that was the way to get them into some kind of agreement that he could say, look, I've used diplomacy and solved this problem. Here's my legacy. Don't I get a Nobel Peace Prize? Whatever. It failed. But, and you know the figures better than I of where the regime was at the end of the first Trump administration and where it had gone in terms of resources and money from that the Biden administration has allowed. That said, you'll sort this out for me. The regime is not in good shape economically right now. You had a very good piece, I also want you to talk about it, in the New York Post, that here is this oil-rich nation where they have an energy crisis. Right now, they're having an energy crisis, and the rial, the currency, is at its historic low vis-a-vis the dollar, despite the fact that they've been enriched through waivers and ignoring sanctions and allowing the sale of oil at cheaper prices to China, which helps China. Despite all that, and now if the Trump administration should bear down economically and in other ways, the regime could not have a lot of resources left for such things as supporting Hezbollah. Again, they're getting money from other ways, through drug sales, through money laundering, through working with international criminal cartels. By the way, none of this bothers the UN or most of the international community. None of it. Anyhow, let me let you take off from there.
Sure. No, and thanks for the very kind words about the piece. The reason I mentioned that this is the medium-term goal of Ali Khamenei is he has a more acute short-term goal. And that gets precisely to why you mentioned the waivers and the pulled punches and unenforced sanctions of Biden. And that's the nuclear issue. And 2025, we have a saying in Persian, it means destiny creating years. It sounds nicer in Persian. Salhay sarnevesh saz. Destiny creating years. 2025 is going to be a destiny creating year, both for the Islamic Republic, but also in the history of the Iranian nuclear program, which goes back much longer than the Islamic Republic. This program is basically on a razor's edge. It's a stone's throw from an actual weapons capability. And the decision Ali Khamenei is going to have to make this year, given the return of maximum pressure, given exactly what you mentioned, which is the Israeli gutting of the transnational terror architecture, particularly in the post-October 7 Middle East, he's going to have to decide if he goes full for a nuclear weapon and tries to dangle or rattle his nuclear saber, kind of like what Putin is doing, or if he's going to try to lure the West back into some kind of a nuclear deal to limp along to buy time. Either way, Ali Khamenei's decisions and the decisions of his lieutenants in his regime on the nuclear issue are going to far exceed any other decision they make as it relates to their regime security and their regime's foreign policy. So everything today is riding on the last few very hard decisions that they've delayed and put aside for perfection towards essentially now. So while 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I would say that it's important to look at everything holistically when discussing the Iranian challenge. It is very clear today that you cannot put the regional issue above the nuclear issue. You cannot put any of the other issues above the nuclear issue, because it's how he dances and defines and plays with this one issue that is going to set the predicate for how you choose to stand with the Iranian people, how you choose to deal with the transnational terror organizations, how you choose to deal with everything else that emanates from that country. So we need both an Iran policy and a nuclear policy, not just a nuclear policy and not just a broader Iran policy, because it's the nuclear issue that gives us this sense of urgency for it being a destiny-creating year. And in the back and forth, I'm happy to get into the other domestic shortcomings like energy, but watch Khamenei this year, 2025, on the nuclear issue.
Well, I want to do more. I've got some questions that I really genuinely don't understand entirely, and I know a lot of people don't. So, if the goal right now is to stop the regime in Tehran from developing a nuclear weapon, that the capabilities the U.S. has to do that are fairly robust. Essentially, you use as I understand it, no secret here, you use B-2s out of Missouri with MOPS. What is MOP? The acronym for
the massive ordnance penetrator.
Massive ordnance penetrator, and you wipe out Fordo and Natanz, and that's the end of it. And the U.S. could do it in about 24 hours. Tell me if I'm wrong. The Israelis don't have either B-2s or MOPS, so they could do damage, but it would be much harder, take much longer, maybe weeks. Not as clear that they could do significant damage, but that's what they would do. So have I got this correct so far?
Yeah, largely. It might be like a week-long operation, depending on every site. If you go after every laboratory, every storage facility, every declared nuclear site, if the Israelis, like in the past, have info on undeclared nuclear sites, you go after the breadth and depth of the program, and you basically prepare to defend against whatever you think would be their response. But yes, the buried sites in Natanz and Fordo, you need the MOP for. The rest, you just need a lot of conventional air power for, standoff weaponry, which is a lot easier to deploy now because of, again, the loss of their long-range air defense. They still have low and mid-tier air defense, which could pose something of a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable challenge. It's like just navigating a plane that has turbulence. You'll still get to your destination. It could have a few bumps along the way.
Now, let's suppose that just for the sake of discussion, that neither the U.S. nor the Israelis do that, and Ayatollah Khamenei gets his nuclear weapon. It is not at that point a nuclear weapon miniaturized to a warhead that can go atop a missile yet. Am I right on that? And how much time is necessary, or does anyone know, between when you have a weapon and when you have it miniaturized for a warhead ready to go on an intercontinental ballistic missile that could be used against Israel, or since it's intercontinental, it could be used against New Orleans or Hollywood or Washington or New York? Explain that part of it.
Well, there's three parts here. Let me segment it out, because they already have the first part, which is the nuclear weapons capability. They have the fissile material. A country that can enrich to 20% purity, which is considered highly enriched, can easily go all the way up to 90%, which is the standard for weapons-grade uranium. The Islamic Republic is now steadily enriching at 60%, which is a stone's throw from 90%, because enrichment is not linear, it's logarithmic. So if you're at 60, you're more than 90+% of the way to 90% purity. Oh, and just for good measure, this regime accidentally last year went to 83, 84%, just to prove that, they could go up the final ladder if they wanted to. So this is much more of a political impediment for them than a technical impediment. So in terms of the fissile material, the enrichment, they've mastered that, unfortunately. The second is a delivery vehicle. Yes, they would need an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, to reach the US or potentially the UK, but large swaths of the European continent and across all of the Middle East, they have largely, but not exclusively, the weapons to do that. All of the Middle East, 2,000 kilometers plus a little bit of Southern Europe, they can strike with even their medium-range systems today. And all of Iran's medium-range systems, including the ones that fired at Israel, by the way, are technically capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. The challenge with miniaturization is, can you get a small enough bomb on a small enough warhead? That's more of a physics question, but they have at least three or four classes that can fit some of the bigger kind of publicly known bomb designs, bomb diagram that unfortunately they've had in the past, and that unfortunately we know existed with Iraq's program, and unfortunately could be found on the internet. And the real challenge here is, even though you hear this thing in the press called the breakout timeline, or how much time it takes for Iran to get the fissile material for one bomb, which is well under a week, it's just a matter of days, actually. It's much more of an intelligence debate, how much time they would need to weaponize and miniaturize to put on that missile. And the public numbers there are as low as about 6 months, probably even a touch lower, I would say, given what they've done in the past, to about as high as 18 months. And this is as much a political issue as it is a technical issue, because not everyone is drawing from the same well as to what we know about Iran's past weapons activities that could put it in a good place to go for the present. So in terms of a capability, roughly they have that capability. They are nearly a threshold nuclear state, if not already a threshold nuclear state. They simply haven't mastered the weaponization cycle, or at least from what we know, haven't mastered the weaponization cycle, and would have anywhere from 6 to 18 months to perfectly mount it and have it be deliverable for a small arsenal. Nonetheless, 6 to 18 months is not a long time, because the sense of urgency is really brought to you by that ability to enrich for one weapon, which is just under a week, because the large volume of uranium that they have on their territory that's already enriched.
So if you are advising either Trump or Netanyahu in that period what to do, what's the advice you're giving, and what's the other advice other deputies are suggesting that disagrees with yours?
Well, I'm going to be talking for as long as I can in the Oval Office until they eject me, because there's a lot I have to say. Step number one is, this is not a stop the bomb. This is a stop the regime. A component of stopping the regime is stopping the bomb. Philosophically, you want to get these guys to know that. The second thing is, you have to defang this regime. A regime that believes you're going to be pulling punches against its proxies in Iraq, and especially pulling punches against its proxies in Yemen, is not going to believe you're going to use this capability. And because we don't want needlessly a wider war in the Middle East, you have to defang the Houthis. You have to go after the IRGC wherever they are deployed, in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, perhaps even in Bahrain, wherever else these guys are. You have to make sure that they know they are not safe. You want them to see if there is that change in the regime's calculus. And then you have to put forward several ultimatums. I know that the President Trump, even back in 2015-16, he campaigned on, I buy bad deals, I make them good deals. Again, even when confronted with regime change and the military option during this most recent campaign, he has again talked about wanting a deal. I think the way you have to honestly speak to the president is to say, Mr. President, these folks are not your equals. Don't forget, they're trying to kill you at the same time. What you shouldn't do is offer them a win-win. What you should offer to them is an ultimatum. This is not an arms control deal. This has to be a denuclearization or a counterproliferation, or a counterproliferation deal a la South Africa, for example, where they have to really dismantle their nuclear program. And you have to give the regime a timeline for inspections and a timeline for dismantlement. And if they don't live up to that timeline, then there's real military consequences, particularly against some of these facilities. But in the period when you're negotiating with the International Atomic Energy Agency, with European partners, because you want to make sure that everyone agrees to this, offer of, you have to dismantle your program. You want to see them be able to defang themselves voluntarily. You want to make sure that if there is military action, it comes with the most international legitimacy as possible. You don't want to do it in a world where you have just the Americans and the Israelis create another failed state in the Middle East, and the Western alliance structure that was so united on preventing a nuclear bomb in Iran now really falls apart. And also, if you have no political plan, this is imperative as well, to deal with this regime and the fallout, then you're going to have basically an AQCon program on steroids. So you got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time here. So really, I would say you want to do really tough max pressure on day one, go after all of the revenues, take no holds barred, no prisoners. You basically want to economically suffocate this regime as fast as possible. You want to express support for the Iranian people who continue to protest, who continue to turn out every day for a better life. You want to make sure that the proxy network is militarily demolished in the region. And at the same time, you want to be working hand in glove with the Israelis on military exercises that feature elements like the B-2. The U.S. did this recently under the Juniper Oak exercises. They should put one together again as soon as possible. And then you want to negotiate with your European partners about what that submission deal, what that denuclearization deal, not that arms control deal, that denuclearization deal looks like, and then get them to agree to a timeline where if the Islamic Republic doesn't agree to this timeline, then there will be military consequences. And you want to move all of these pieces of the chessboard at the same time. And it takes a skilled chef to be able to do all of them.
Yeah, I'm not sure we have those. One thing, two things occur to me. One is wonderful to have international legitimacy, but don't think the UN in any way, the Security Council of the UN, permanent members are China and Russia. They're not going along with this. Tehran's their ally. If they want
that's why
weapons, they will have. The General Assembly is not going to do anything. Not that they have any, but they wouldn't be on your side. And I'm not sure you don't want Belgium to have a veto power over what you do here. If you decide as the U.S. that you do not think that this regime that threatens death to America, that tried to kill Trump, should have nuclear weapons, then you have to you do what you can to bring your allies in. But at the end of the day, you decide what you have to do, and you do it. And when you talk about military consequences, I always want to understand capabilities. Let's say, just hypothetically, we know that if we were to know that the Islamic Republic of Iran has a nuclear weapon and it's on a missile, maybe one or two, you can destroy them before they are launched. You can destroy them in flight if you have to. We do have those capabilities at this moment, or do we not?
The U.S. has significant left of launch capabilities, but in a world where the Islamic Republic is a nuclear power, I don't even want to have to deal with the consequences of them, not even, of them mounting those, because you will never be able to tell, is this projectile nuclear tipped or not? So you never want to be in that world, which is precisely why you want to be in the prevention world. The left of launch capabilities that we have to stop the drones and stop the missiles, that's electronic warfare, that's cyber, and that's kinetic action. That's stuff you want to do when, you're fighting against an Iranian ballistic missile barrage, in a world where hypothetically you're doing a counter-proliferation strike on their nuclear program, right? You're going after nuclear targets. They are responding against America, against American positions in the region, against Israel with conventional ballistic missiles. That's where the left of launch operations begin. That's basically where you have satellite-enabled imagery of where these missile cities are underground or where the tells above ground are, and you're striking at the known missile facilities before the known missile facilities are launching in response to your counter-proliferation launch. That is a world where the U.S. obviously has the conventional advantage. But in a world where the Islamic Republic has nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, you don't want to take that risk, which is precisely why we need to be in the prevention business rather than the containment and deterrence and management business of, okay, now they have a nuclear weapon. Every time they launch a missile, we're going to have to understand, is it a nuclear tipped missile or a conventional missile? That's a world we don't want to be in with the Iranians.
So if I can oversimplify, are you saying that in this year, 2025, what the Trump administration and the Israelis need to figure out is how to destroy or significantly set back the nuclear weapons program we know the Islamic Republic of Iran has, significantly set it back so that we know that they are not going to have nuclear weapons attached to missiles ready for launch anytime soon? Is that the goal?
That is a goal. I think the overarching goal is you got to topple this regime. You will never be safe until you topple this regime. That's the overarching goal. A component of that is making sure that the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism does not have the world's most dangerous weapons. And necessarily there is a military component to that. And I want to go to one thing you mentioned, which is the UN and our European partners. I believe, as President Bush said, I think many years ago, the U.S. does not need a permission slip to defend itself. I believe that wholeheartedly. There is no fat on that sentence. This is not about a permission slip to defend ourselves. This is about making sure we incur no own goals along the way. Part of Ali Khamenei's strategy, and even there is a robust debate about this at FDD, is to say, you drove me to the bomb. It's like someone who wants to commit suicide and keeps running to the ledge of a building but never jumps. And then when you try to grab them when they do jump, they say, hey, you pushed me, as they fall all the way down and drag you down with them. This is what they've been architecting. This helps explain the sentences that you hear now out of Iranian leaders 11 times in the past few months about them having a capability to go for a weapon if they wanted to, or they could have, had they had a weapon, they would have been able to save the life of Hania, things like that. So there's a fundamentally different risk calculus here. I, for different reasons, believe Khamenei still is fudging, still is dragging his feet a little bit. This country's nuclear program is unlike any other we've seen in history. There's parallels, but it's not a copy-paste of a dash for a bomb like Pakistan or North Korea, for example. This is taking a very long time, and that's because they're taking as many rest stops as possible. And as much as they try to take a rest stop, we need to rebuild our deterrent and reduce the room for maneuver. So step number 1 for Trump, max pressure 2.0 on steroids. Step number 2, robust military exercises in the region. Step number 3, the U.S. is a partner with the Israelis in dismantling the axis of resistance. Step number 4, you come up with the Europeans with a dismantlement plan for the nuclear program. And the deadline with the Europeans is if they don't agree to this, then they're going to know that military action is basically a certainty. And step number 5 is a plan to stand with the street. Take your cues from the street in Iran, not from the state in Iran. The state is trying to put us into this binary of only focusing on the nuclear program, hoping that we fudge it. They're also hoping, by the way, that our conversations are entirely among ourselves and circuitous, and that Trump's desire for a deal overrides or overarches everything that we've been saying today.
And the idea is that once they inveigle him in negotiating a deal, they'll be better at it than he will be, because they're very good at this sort of thing, at saying, here's the deal that you can say I won, but we in fact will be the ones who win. In other words, that they'll be better bargaining in the marketplace and the shuk than will Trump, even though he thinks he's good at it.
That's precisely the point. And let me add 2 footnotes here just for the audience to know. One is the human rights debate, the political debate in Iran, the civil society debate has drastically changed since 2015. This is imperative to know. You can't find human rights people today that would support, it's very hard to find, I would say, human rights folks that would support a deal with a government like the Islamic Republic that does things that it does on a daily basis to the Iranian citizenry. The cat is far out of the bag there. So hypothetically, if FDD is endorsing, which we're not, some sort of limited nuclear deal with the Islamic Republic, we would be hit from folks to our left, from our right. This is a very important thing for the Trump administration to know, that even the human rights folks are to the right now. This is point number 1. Point number 2 is that Ali Khamenei's regime is much more weak and much more brittle than it appears. And this reminds me of things that Iranian ministers of intelligence used to say, a former one, that the regime is so penetrated that officials should not sleep safely at night. And there may be a real covert answer or intelligence answer to the crisis that you and I seem to be discussing in a binary way, about getting maximum defections, about getting internal saboteurs to not have to have us deal with this bomb or no bomb debate. Because I think that would be very fascinating to see how that element plays out in 2025 as well.
Yeah, I listened, and after these Mark Dubitz to talk about this a lot. Anything we can do to support those in Iran who would like a better regime, we should absolutely do. I totally endorse that. I don't underestimate the likelihood that this regime will kill many thousands of its people in order to stay in power. I've said this before. I think the Shah of Iran, who was not supported by Jimmy Carter, also just didn't want to kill 10,000 people in order to stay on the throne. I think Ali Khamenei and will. Now, of course, he's old, and we don't know what happens when he dies or becomes incapacitated or whatever. He's, 85?
He's 86 now.
86. But I am very doubtful that anybody moderate is going to take his place as supreme leader and spiritual guide of the country. I think it's more likely, and you can talk about that, to be somebody like his son who will maintain his legacy of aggression and determination to reestablish or to establish an Islamic empire based with the metropole in Tehran. That's been the goal. Obama said, can't you just share the neighborhood with the Saudis and a little bit with the Israelis? And they have no interest in sharing the neighborhood. They want to be the hegemon. I think that's likely to be the case. Although I guess I do imagine that there could be turmoil when Khamenei, after all these years, shuffles off his mortal coil.
Yeah, absolutely. His death would be a forcing function in a way that 10 or 15 years ago it would not have been, both socially between the state and the street and also within the increasingly narrow pool of regime elites today. I really don't want to say this, but I believe it, so I'll say it. There may be a world in which, if there is no regime change by the time Ali Khamenei is no longer with us, then there may be a time in terms of U.S. national security that we may miss Ali Khamenei. Ali Khamenei's style has been this 1 foot on the gas, 1 foot on the brakes, which is why I've been saying, as much as there is urgency on the nuclear debate, there is even greater urgency on the nuclear debate inside Iran. It's Ali Khamenei's decision to make. It's not our decision to make. We should be careful not to force him to make the wrong decision. We should be careful to force him to make the wrong decision. Precisely, that's what I'm trying to say. We should try to get him to make errors in his judgment. This is the goal of, I think, what a new Israeli-American robust military pushback on his empire should be.
What would be his wrong judgment that would be beneficial to America, Israel, and the West?
So it would be continuing to double down on weapons exports throughout the region, wasting money on the proxies in the region, thinking that the Russians will always have his back when sometimes they haven't, trying to overinvest publicly in that relationship. Right now, for example, the Iranians are delaying implementation of a hijab law. They are unfiltering and allowing access to communications applications like WhatsApp, not because they're moderates or liberals, and not because their view on the hijab or their view on WhatsApp has changed. It's because they know they're losing today. So you actually want to see them think that they're strong enough and confident enough to go back to that heavy-handed approach. Because it's that heavy-handed approach that shows you how vast that chasm between state and society is. Because every time the regime falls short of trying to deliver anything for the Iranian public good or national interest, that is another opportunity for Israel, for America, to point out that there is nothing Iranian about the Iranian regime. There is nothing that this regime has done to support the population. So you want to be able to point to this very vast chasm. Also, in terms of Iran, the Islamic Republic thinking it can conventionally strike at Israel. What if they do another missile operation? In my view, that would be a mistake. But maybe you want them to lead with their chin on that, so you go after greater targets. And this is not just, FDD talking about the military option here. The audience should know that there are even people who served in the Obama administration who are talking about this. I would point folks to a very interesting piece just a day or so ago by Richard Nephew, one of the sanctions czars and deal architects of the 2015 deal known as the JCPOA, talking precisely about this, about you go for a final deal. If not, it is the military option. This isn't Cliff. This isn't Behnam. This isn't FDD saying this. This is one of the architects of the JCPOA saying this. This is how far the Islamic Republic has gotten away with murder.
All right. One more subject I want to pick your brains on before we close out for today. And that's what's happened in Syria, because, well, tell me if I'm exaggerating or would be exaggerating to say that a month ago, Syria was a colony of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Today, it may be a colony of Ankara, of Turkey, of the Neo-Ottoman Empire of Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Is that going too far?
I don't think it's going. It's a little bit of hyperbole, but it's rooted entirely in fact. The political order in Damascus was based on the Russian-Iranian model.
Right.
Now it's much more beholden to Ankara, even though there is desire by some of the folks in Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, in HTS, to distance themselves from the rest of the SNA, the Syrian National Army folks, who are entirely Turkish-backed. This is brought to you, in my view, by Erdogan earlier this year trying to play footsie with Assad. Assad, forgive me, giving Erdogan the finger, and an Erdogan doubling, tripling down on the Arab proxies that he has, and really driving and have success militarily beget success, such that the entire western chain of cities fell to HTS rapidly. The regime had to withdraw both proxies and diplomatic personnel, and Iran has lost its sole state partner in the entire Arab world. And it really was the state that enabled the regime to engage in this terror across the war zones of the Middle East, because it was a permissive environment into Lebanon, into Iraq, into elsewhere, particularly against Israel as well.
Yeah, look, I am not among those at all. And we know what here at FDD is who believes that the new ruler of Syria, who went by the name of Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, is a moderate, is somebody who seeks peace. I don't believe any of that. I do think he may be acutely aware of the fact that he comes to power not inheriting the military assets that Bashar al-Assad had as dictator of Syria, because the Israelis, in just a few days, managed to wipe out the naval vessels, the Air Force, weapons factories, chemical weapons, all sorts of things. He is much more limited. At the same time, I think that he recognizes that he needs Erdogan, he needs Turkish support, but he also may not want to be entirely a colony of Turkey. And I say that because people forget that the Iranians are major people of the Middle East. The Turks are a major people of the Middle East. The Arabs are a major people of the Middle East. The Kurds are. The Israelis, the Jews are. These are all separate peoples of the Middle East. Now, Islam was meant to unite all the peoples of the Middle East and beyond. The problem is that the question then arises, yes, under whose rulership? Under that of Tehran? Under that of Riyadh and the Saudis? Although the Saudis don't seem to be neo-imperialists the way the Turks are now under Erdogan, or the way the Iranians are under Khamenei. There's always that problem. And I think Abu Muhammad al-Jolani certainly appears to be aware of the fact that he is an Arab, and though he needs the Turks, he may not want to be a servant of the Turks. I do see that sort of shaping up. Do you agree?
I do see that. And, you mentioned these major peoples of the region. The conflict between Iran and Turkey, but also Turkey and Israel, and we already know about the conflict between the Islamic Republic and Israel. These are the conflicts that I believe are going to set to define the state order in the Middle East for the next 10 to 50 years. And, I would zoom in on actually the Turkish-Israeli relationship. The theme that me and actually a former FDD colleague, Merve Tahirolu, who was a Turkey specialist, came up with to define the Turkey-Iran relationship at that time in 2015 was frenemies. We talked about this theory of compartmentalization. Erdogan and Khamenei could compartmentalize their conflicts and then collaborate a lot more. Even though they both fought for the title of champions of the Palestinians and champions of the Muslim world, they were able to compartmentalize that. With the loss of Syria, not at all. Particularly when you look at some of the other things that Turkey is doing in the region, with supporting Azerbaijan, much more so with creating its own government-funded Persian language channel. There's a lot of things Turkey is doing that on a state level competition is really rubbing the regime in Iran the wrong way. But this theme about compartmentalization is now going to move into the Israeli-Turkish relationship. And I think this creates a lot of challenges for American administrations who kind of just see Turkey as a NATO ally and don't put on the right kind of glasses to look at all the thorns in the relationship between Erdogan and Israel. So we're going to have to be better at helping manage and deconflict this Turkish-Israeli relationship, because it's the pits and troughs of that relationship, particularly as we will see in Syria, that are going to cause major issues for the U.S. and for the balance of power in the region. So I would look very closely at the Turkey-Israel relationship and what else Turkey is doing in the region vis-a-vis its renewed diplomacy with some of the GCC states, with the UAE, its military involvement in Libya in the past. Turkey is a very different kind of player. I would use the word imperialist, as you used correctly, to describe this more expansive foreign policy. And so there is an opportunity to, if you can get Syria more embedded into the Arab order, particularly into the pro-status quo Arab order, the Saudi order, not the Qatari order, that would be a win, because not only would it have been plucked from the Iran-backed axis, but you could enmesh it into some of the, more pro-status quo things that would deny the regime in Tehran this permissive environment that it had in Syria for quite a long time, while also not letting it fall. I think like Khrushchev called Iran back in the Cold War, like a ripe fruit into the hands of the Turks.
This sort of, this is my final question for today. This sort of seems to me sets up a more competitive and perhaps more antagonistic relationship between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, because Turkey wants to dominate. Turkey wants to dominate the Arabs of Syria. Maybe the Saudis think, no, we should be the most influential with Sunni Arabs anywhere in this region, not the Turks, for all kinds of historical reasons. Or one historical reason, Arabs don't welcome the return of the Ottoman Empire.
I would say that depends a great deal on the risk-taking of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, how much he may want to invest in Syria, particularly as he has Vision 2030 in the background. He's even pulled away from some state-level competition with the Iranians. So it's not like the attitudes of the Saudis or the pro-status quo order in the Middle East has changed towards Tehran or Ankara. But their willingness to at least engage in this transactional diplomacy is brought to by the fact that the Saudis don't believe that the American patron, the American guarantor, has been as good in the present as it has been in the past. So they've had to hedge a heck of a lot more. B, they see a rising Israel, so more interest in normalization to offset these security challenges than perhaps in the American patron. So I think that is pretty particularly interesting. But we'll see how things shape up post 2030, and even if the leader in Syria today, Mr. Jolani, went back to his old name, Mr. Shara, does vis-a-vis his outreach to the Saudis. I think it's very interesting that he chose Al Arabiya, a Saudi-funded outlet, for his interview rather than Al Jazeera, a Qatari-funded outlet. He also seems to be playing up his background of being born in Saudi Arabia, if I'm not mistaken. But we shouldn't read too much into this, but it is at least worth mentioning for now.
And the last thing I'll mention is how interesting that even the Palestinians in the West Bank are now banning Al Jazeera, which is, of course, the propaganda platform of the Qatari regime. And the Qatari regime, which we'll talk more about in future episodes, supports Hamas, plays footsie with the U.S., I think plays the U.S. while being very close to the regime in Tehran. I think it's a very much a false friend, and I think the Biden administration made a huge mistake in making it a major non-NATO ally and doing so as a sort of bribe, hoping that's what it would evolve into, and it has not.
Indeed.
I'll leave it there. Behnam, good to talk to you today on this first broadcast of the new year, and thanks for all of you who have been listening and been with us today on this episode of Foreign Policy.